Hi, I'm Kayla Hathaway, a partner here at Cimpatico Studios. Cimpatico is a platform dedicated to cultivating conversations and actions on complex social issues with professionals all around the world. On the Climate EDU channel, I interview academics about university programs, careers, research, internships, and published literature like books and papers. If you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now, on to today's show. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Climate EDU. I'm your host, Kayla Hathaway, and I'm joined once again by our lovely reoccurring guest, Gerald Kootenay. For those who do not know who he is the incredible author of the book Carbon Politics and the Failure of the Kyoto Protocol, and his consulting company, Sixth Element, also does some really awesome environmental things, and you should totally check it out. And Gerald, thank you so much for joining us for our final book series episode.
So glad to be back. And I'm so sad it's the last one.
I know. At least you're still writing, so we'll have much more to talk about. So
sounds good.
Mm-hmm. So, man, part 5 of your book, going about the best paths moving forward. Last week we talked about the EU and how a little bit of poking fun at Germany. But yeah, with the state of everything and the results of Kyoto and Paris, just what do we do? How do we move forward in the best, most productive way?
That's always a big question. When I wrote the book, it was pretty well completed in late 2012, early 2013. So it's 7 or 8 years old now. And I glanced over the chapter again just to refresh my mind what I'd written back then. And I found that a lot of it hasn't changed that much. The most important thing is to do something. And that sounds a little cliche, but so many countries aren't doing anything.
Yeah.
You can't just use business as usual as a way of resolving the climate crisis. It's what politicians prefer to do because business as usual means you don't have to do anything special. But with climate change, you do. When people look at, what are the most important things to do? The thing that comes up that most experts agree on, and certainly it's very popular among economists, is using the so-called market-based mechanisms. And one of the key aspects of that is putting a price on carbon. People talk a lot about it. Some people call it carbon tax. Yeah, people refer to it as a carbon tax because they're trying to scare people that they're just trying to get every last penny out of them. That's unfair. I sometimes refer to it as a sin tax, like you have with cigarettes and booze. That's a little bit fair, but in lots of cases, I'll give you one that we have in Canada right now. We have a carbon tax. The right hates it. It's very controversial from them. And they say the same thing every single time. And everyone who opposes a carbon tax says the same thing. You're hurting poor families. You're taking money. They aren't going to be able to feed their families. Small businesses are going to have to close down. That's rubbish.
Mm-hmm.
It's simply propaganda. You have to look at the details of what these programs propose. The one in Canada, for example, and this is an analysis of the parliamentary budget officer of the Canadian government. There's a rebate that's in your income tax. And it's supposed to cover up to 80% of the lower income bracket. So that means only 20% of the population actually lose money on that. And not only do we get to claim it on our income tax, we get to claim it on the year before we actually pay the carbon tax. So essentially what happens when I do my income tax, by the time I get my rebate and stuff, I'm getting the rebate in March for that year when I've only spent it for a few months. And I'm not just promoting the Canadian one. Dr. Hansen has famously talked about the fee and dividend, which this is very much alike. The idea is you charge people for it, but you make sure they get their money back from it. Very interesting concept. Then you say, well, why in hell does that inspire anything to happen? Well, there's two major reasons for that. If you reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, you're making more money off of it because your dividend doesn't change. More importantly, it sets the price for corporations. Corporations generally like a price on carbon because in the business world, if they're going to invest something, let's say they're going to invest $50 million to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, saying it's because it's a good thing to do doesn't fly very well with their shareholders. But if they can say for every ton of carbon I'm saving $50 a ton, and therefore that $50 million investment will be paid off in 2 years or whatever the number can be, they want that. And they want it to be assured, and they have no problem with it. It allows them to do their business properly.
So it sounds like the financial motive is definitely something to be considered.
Well, the one thing I look at, like, how do we get this ball rolling? How do we get people really into this? The battle is really won is when people, but more importantly, corporations do this on their own without being pushed.
Hmm.
And so if you have a system that corporations, and this is growing, and this is becoming more and more, that corporations are starting to take the lead. And this is going to happen more and more. And then you don't have to worry about government anymore.
Mhm.
Business will take care of it by themselves. But to get to that stage, they have to be pushed by government to do so and pushed by us. They're consumers, they're shareholders. We all have to push. So government, consumers, and shareholders all have to push corporations to start doing something about their emissions.
Mhm. So it's like if we go and get government to start enacting regulation policies and like environmental protections, then eventually corporations will do it, then just kind of keep the ball rolling because it makes sense financially. Then it just kind of becomes like the self-perpetuating system of like, yeah, taking care of the planet is actually kind of profitable and we have healthier people. So maybe we should just continue it. I don't know.
Well, that's exactly. And to be blunt, corporate capitalism
Mm,
doesn't care about any nation. It doesn't care about society. They care about their profits.
yeah.
So give them the incentive. They will listen to their shareholders if they push strong enough. They will listen to the consumer if the consumer pushes enough. And they also have to react to when government passes edicts that they see it as their best interest to respond to.
Mhm.
Otherwise, they have a tendency to fight tooth and nail against these sort of incentives, as we have seen with the fossil fuel industry against any activity in the US to try to do something about climate change.
Mhm. Um, so it just kind of makes you wonder, right? So like we have companies like Exxon, BP, Chevron, who have been put through the ringer for obvious reasons and a bunch of suits and everything. And they make these pledges of like, yeah, we're gonna go green and we have this green initiative, but then they're kind of just reinvesting more in like single-use plastics or plastic items, which is what I've been noticing. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering like how do we tell them like, hey, you can't do that either.
But I think it's the same sort of way. As you said, you tell them.
Mhm.
Again, communications with businesses, you hurt them in their bottom line.
Mhm.
And we buy their products. They
Yeah.
don't force us to buy their products. So the choice is up to us. First primary stage to go ahead. There's a tendency for people to say, well, gee whiz, why isn't the government taking care of this?
Mhm.
It's so easy to point to other people. It's the oil companies that are to blame. It's the government to blame. It's Trump to blame. Point is, I worry about what I do because I have a tendency to control what I do. At least I think I control what I do. And so I worry about yourself first. It's amazing the power of the individual. There's 7.8 billion of us in the world. We don't need all of us to be moving in this direction. But if the world wants to react to do something, We can do this.
Mhm.
And it's the same thing. Politicians, they react to us. They react to the electorate. Businesses respond to the consumer. It's all coming back to us as individuals. And this is not a radical system that there's a few advocates that's out there. I always like to give the example, well, what can one person really do?
Mhm.
Greta Thunberg, everyone knows her name today.
Yeah.
She hasn't been around for a long time. Her first strike, where she took a cardboard sign and sat outside the Swedish parliament for her one-person demonstration, happened 2 years ago.
Oh,
2
2 years ago.
years ago.
It feels like forever, right? Because she's been so mainstream. But
Exactly. What has happened since? She has she's been invited to meet presidents,
mhm.
prime ministers. She has met the Pope. She has presented to the United Nations General Assembly. And just last week, there was an article from the Dalai Lama of Tibet praising the activity of Greta Thunberg.
Mhm.
That is one young person did. And all she did was start 2 simple years ago, no backing, no fanfare, no nothing. Now, everything you do won't turn out of how Greta did.
Mhm.
But I can tell you, if you don't do anything, nothing will ever happen.
No, I
It's,
completely agree.
so you have to go out there, lead this, don't point to what other people are not doing. We were talking about this before the show, about China has now said by 2060, they're going to be carbon neutral.
Mhm.
A lot of people point at China for their growth in coal and their growth in emissions. I don't live in China. I get criticized, by the way, all the time for not picking in China. I
Mhm.
pick on my Canadian government because we're so friendly with the Americans. I pick on your government too. But generally, I don't pick on other people's governments.
Yeah.
And I'm not looking to put the blame on someone else. If I could force China, somehow influence China, I would.
Mhm.
I can't. So worry about what you influence.
Mhm.
And so don't point to your neighbor. Look at your own home first.
Mhm. No, and that's something that I struggle with in just the way of communicating it, right? So like there's always been like this big narrative of like, oh well, you as the individual, it's your fault for X, Y, and Z. At least that was like the ads that were kind of rolled out around I forget the year, but there's that like very like famous ad where it's like the Native American and like the trash like being thrown out in the road, and it's like only
Yeah,
you like can
and the
do
guy's
this
crying with the
with it. Yeah, yeah.
yes, very
And
powerful ad.
yeah, and then like with that, it just became this whole like, big corporations who are producing these products are like, it's not our problem, it's your problem. But then I look around, like say in the area where I live, and to get to the nearest recycling center, you have to drive quite a bit, and there's not. So it's like, well, how would you even recycle? And you look at the actual process of recycling and how like a lot of things actually don't get recycled in the United States, and it's just a nasty chain. That goes on for a while. So like then I think like, okay, so well as an individual, what can I do? And it's like, well, I can try to drive less. I mean, bless my job, I work remote and it's always going to be remote. And or buying foods at the farmers market so it's more local, reducing emissions that way, adopting a more like vegetarian or vegan diet as much as I can. And then I feel like we kind of, or at least I feel like most of the time the conversation just kind of stops there. Um, and then the next step is like, well, once you have all these individual things, then now it's time to get involved in local government and like sit into your city council meetings and go and actually write to people or maybe even run for office. And I feel like those options just aren't talked about as much as they really should be. I feel like sometimes a lot of people think that like it's impossible, like, oh, being involved in my local government, that's so much responsibility. or like it's so scary. And it's like, but that's what we do. Like if we're gonna change, we have to. I forget who it was. There's this quote from someone that was like, "If you don't see the representation you want in your government, then why don't you run to be that representation?" Or something like that. It was kind of like that, but
Well, even
yeah.
taking that in a little bit simpler stage is very good what you're suggesting. And the important thing, by the way, is that we all have to react differently to this. don't make yourself uncomfortable. There's so many things you can do that should come naturally to you if you want to do it. What I do does not have to be what you do. If I want to be a vegan and you don't want to be, that's okay. It's not wrong, but then you're doing something that I'm not doing.
Mhm.
You mentioned that the simplest thing in the world for most people to do, the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. That
Mhm.
benefits everything, including climate change.
Yeah.
When you talk about individuals, there's only 3 things that we have to do. We act, and that's what you've been describing. How can we act? There's long lists of them, how we can act. And so the important thing is think about it. And you think, hey, yeah, I can do that. I'm going to start putting LED bulbs in. I'm going to, take public transit. It doesn't matter. It's what's available to you and what you can do.
Mhm.
The important thing is do something. The second one is engage. Engage with your politicians. Engage with your friends that aren't believing in climate change, or maybe aren't doing enough, or giving them polite suggestions. Don't get into a fight with them. That they're not necessarily evil people. They just not may understand the consequences of it. And the third one, which is pivotal, is you vote. You vote who you want for. Now, someone should never force you to vote for someone.
Mhm.
But when you're voting, climate change has to be a top priority. If you don't vote, you don't care.
Mhm.
And so it's okay. In the US, you only have 2 parties. So you
Yeah.
have to choose one or the other. You can vote for a fringe party, but it's almost the same thing as not voting because it won't affect the election that much,
Mhm.
or you don't vote. If it's a situation that you're down to the lesser of 2 evils, it's still worthwhile voting. I
Mhm.
can think of no situation where you should simply say, I am so cynical about my politics in my country that I shouldn't vote.
Yeah.
There are people that die trying to get the right to vote. We get to take it for granted, at least for now, about that right to vote. And so again, I stress very, very much the power of the vote. Politicians exist, most of them, to get reelected.
Yeah.
And so the power again of the individual, you act, you engage, you vote.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder about like the idea of term limits, especially here in the US. Like that's been a huge conversation just since like last week. Um and how like we need to vote and take like action even though like I have my own personal stance on electoral politics. But there needs to be some systematic overhaul, and that's not going to happen if people don't take action and think about it in the long term. Like how you mentioned, having climate change being like one of the most important issues to vote on, because I I just feel like a part of the message isn't getting through. Of like once we hit 2030, if emissions continue as they are, we literally don't know what's going to happen. Like we have guesses and everything, but we don't have a historical like analysis of like what will happen. And yeah.
You're identifying the real problem with climate change. It's not meant to be handled by democracies. There probably isn't a democracy in the world that's set up to handle it. Why is that? The problem is you are asking politicians to do something. And you remember, to do something usually costs money. So let's presume it costs some money. But you may not see the benefit or be able to quantify that benefit for a decade or longer. If the opposition wants to take advantage of that, any fool can do it when it comes to a climate change policy. We're seeing that in Canada. I mentioned the carbon tax before.
Yeah.
Someone say, well, I've been paying this crappy carbon tax for 3 years and our emissions are still going up. And so it just shows that what you're doing isn't worth anything. It's not how it works. But it is a political dilemma of any time you want to do something for the long term, and you'll see the benefit in the long term where electoral cycles every 4 years.
Mhm.
In the US, it's almost worse because you have your election cycles every 2 years for the Senate and House. And so you're talking about people being continuously in election mode.
Yeah.
The problem of always being in election mode is that you're focused so much on the short term. And sometimes the most important decisions the government makes, at the time, a lot of people don't like them. It takes guts for a politician to do that, because if they ever pass things that the general populace doesn't like at the time, even though if you think about it, it's for the greater good no matter what, and longer term, everyone benefits. It could cost them their reelection when it comes up.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of seeing that with it was like AOC and Ed Markey, with their Green New Deal, and how they're just incredibly demonized. And you'd be proud of me here. I was touting about the Green New Deal on my Twitch Twitter, right? There was just about the wildfires, and I was just like, we need a Green New Deal. Like, that this is absurd. This shouldn't be happening. Someone came in and was like, I will never support the Green New Deal because it's anti-white. And I'm like, all right, hold up. So I sent them the link to the actual doc, like, was it congress.gov, and its actual document. I'm like, tell me where exactly that it says that, cause this is, I don't get this. And then they took the screenshot of the paragraph where it's like, I feel like they didn't even finish reading the whole paragraph. They just got through the first sentence, which was like equity for Indigenous, people of color, and minorities. And they're like, see, told you. And then but the last part is like women, children, disabled, homeless. And so I had to go and be like, hey, so I don't know if you know this, but white people can also be women or children or have disabilities. And then they just immediately went and blocked me. I was like, Gerald would be.
Well, of course, now you're getting me started because you're on my favorite topic. And it's your fault. You introduced it.
Oh, no. Okay. It's our last episode. It's a party.
Okay, we're talking about propaganda. People like to call it fake news. This is old school propaganda. Fake news is a euphemism that makes it sound it's okay because it's funny because Donald Trump does it or whatever the case may be. Propaganda is the greatest threat to democracy that has ever existed.
Oh, yeah.
There is nothing worse than that. And essentially what happens is, and you used a perfect example, the Green New Deal, and you look at AOC and the abuse that she takes. 99.9% of the statements that come out in opposition to things like the New Green Deal are lies. They are blatant lies. The problem is they're repeated over and over and over again. Social media, especially like Twitter, which I try to deal with on a regular basis, which is a never-ending task. But the important thing about propaganda, you can say the stupidest thing in the world. Like Hillary Clinton was involved in Pizzagate. Okay, that was a pretty stupid, but it was repeated again and again and more and more people believe it. So you look at it and say, well, no fool's going to believe this. Why should I challenge it? And the problem is, if you don't challenge propaganda, it becomes reality.
Yep.
And you look at places in the world in the past where propaganda has taken over a nation, reminiscent of George Orwell's 1984.
I just started rereading that book, and the parallels to today has me being like, oh my God.
It's scary. And just to remind you, it does not end well.
Yeah.
And at the time, George Orwell was referring to what had happened with Nazism and communism with Stalinistic Russia, of what the next step would be. And the problem is, we see what's happening now, and we have not seen propaganda like we're seeing it now, probably since the days of before World War II. It's becoming so routine, and social media has really unplugged this.
Yeah.
because there is no restraint whatsoever. And the problem is the fringe groups use it as an echo chamber. And so where there's a handful of people, it seems like there's tons of people, when it's not true. It's so critical. If we want to do something about climate change, it's the propaganda that started from the fossil fuel industry that paid for this to take place. That all the junk that I see on Twitter right now against climate change, almost all of it came from the propaganda machine that was financed by the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
It's perpetual.
What's ridiculous is when you go back and actually read the Exxon report. Like, now that the PDF is finally out and everyone has access to it, and you just look at it like, wow, you know, all you had to do was take the high ground. That's it. That's literally all you had to do. I mean, I've been on a history binge just because of like everything lately with the United States and everything, right? And I was reading about what happened with Russia. And like it's kind of the same thing like with not like same thing like with propaganda and like that and everything, but just the thing of like all you had to do was take the high ground. Like Lenin, for example. He lost his like the election. All he had to do was take the high ground and be like, I respect the choice of the people. But he didn't, and then we ended up with Stalin and everything later on. And I think that's something that's been like so unfortunate, and that's something we really need to learn from, is that just taking the higher ground is what prevents these nasty spirals of things. It's like it's literally just one decision that then creates years of stuff.
Well, your example is a good one. Just let me talk about a second for what happened with big oil.
Yeah.
When I got out of school, it's a long time ago, the top jobs for a chemist were within the petroleum industry. They had the elite of the scientific community working for them. They knew about climate change right from the very beginning in the 1950s. And their scientists, even in the 1980s, were continuously warning the executives that this is real. And the executives were paying attention. Okay, they didn't just simply dismiss it. In the late 1980s, three things happened. In 1988, Jim Hansen of NASA testified in the Senate that he had measured global warming and it was being caused by us. Mm-hmm. The real conference in the late 1980s was announced for 1992, where the number one item on the agenda would be climate change. And number three, the IPCC had already been formed and they were going to be doing their first report. Mm-hmm. Big Oil had a simple choice: either work on a long-term plan that would go over decades, that they could wean themselves off of fossil fuels in a controlled manner, or to fight back against the science dirty.
Yep.
And they made the decision, we're going to fight back dirty. And that dirty war has been taking place ever since for over 30 years.
Yep. Yeah. And it's
now you got me going.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm also just here like, all right, like, it's just depressing. And like looking at it in hindsight, right? It's like if they would have still made a lot of money. And that's like something that like I just don't fully grasp, where it's like you could have like continued and gone green and been like the champions of sustainable energy and like basically monopolize the market, right? They're already monopolizing fossil fuels, so like they can go and monopolize like the renewable energy markets. But instead they're like, no, I like my oil.
Well, big oil was a great example of these global corporations that felt that they were above everything else. They're above any government. They're above any regulations. Their job was not to take care of society. Their job was to make a profit.
Yeah.
And that sounds callous and it sounds overdone, But for the fossil fuel industry, it was not. It was very blatant. It applied to other industries as well, and this applies to other industries even today. You know, it's starting to change. It's changing slowly, but still there's a lot of global corporations that don't support anything that has to do with the benefits of society if they don't make a dollar off of doing it.
And it comes down to the question of like how we run our economies and what change we'll have to see in the future. Like, I think I might have already told you this. I just recently watched the movie Soylent Green for the first time, and I was like, so now when I talk with people, I'm like, you know, I would rather us end up in a Star Trek society as opposed to a Soylent Green society. Because it's just watching that movie, and because I think it takes place in what 2020 or 2022, like that movie, like the year that they say is like around this time, and I'm just here like, and this came out so long ago. Oh no. But I mean, I mean, we'll roll into just chatting so we can keep talking. But to roll it back though, to summarize part 5 of your book, and the best paths moving forward, what would you have to say on that?
When it came down to policies, okay, I'm not a policy expert. I don't claim to be, but if there are 3 policies that were ever instituted that I think are the easiest, in other words, that they affect the lifestyle of people the least, but have the biggest bang for their buck. We already mentioned the price on carbon. You know, it's not a devastating impact by any means. Stop coal-fired power plants. They're the largest point sources of GHG emissions in the world. And again, there's lots of good alternatives. It's not that disruptive. And number 3, there's no reason in today's world that the government does not say after a certain particular date, that's reasonable, that all new cars have to be GHG neutral. Maybe they'll most of them be electric, it doesn't have to be. But the car industry, it doesn't hurt them. They have to retool their plants every so many years anyway. And so you automatically take care of your electricity that way. You automatically take care of your transportation that way. And voila, with a couple of relatively simple plans, you've eliminated the bulk of your GHG. We have to eliminate more, but it's a nice, simple step. And then all these things, don't complicate it. Don't get rid of these things that are so complicated that most people don't even understand what you're doing. Do the simple stuff first. The problem has been is we have not even done the simple stuff, which should have been done decades ago.
I completely agree. All right, I'm gonna roll the credits and we're gonna hop into just chatting. Thank you so much for doing this book series with me, Gerald. I really appreciate it, and I am looking forward to hearing your perspective with your. You said that your new book coming out will be called Climate Brawl.
Yeah, and Climate Brawl, the political failure on the climate crisis. I haven't submitted to a publisher yet. It should be ready to send out hopefully end of this year, early next year. And by the way, since our last show, thank you, Kayla, so much, and Cimpatico for having me on. I really enjoyed it. It's just been fantastic.
Cool. Thanks, Gerald. All right, we'll be right back, chat.